Yeah, I think this is what will upset readers the most, is the significant changes they did to. Hello and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today it is time to grab a hot cup of tea because we have been invited to be part of the Thursday Murder Club, which is set in England. So tea is obviously a huge part of their culture. But the Thursday Murder Club is by Richard Osman and it was published in 2020. And I'm comparing it with the movie directed by Chris Columbus, which was released in 2025. It just got released today, the day I'm recording this, and it is available on Netflix. And since this is a new release, my super quick spoiler-free thoughts, I wouldn't discourage anybody from watching this, like not at all. But I also wouldn't strongly encourage it either. If you already have Netflix and you have 2 hours, sure, watch it. I think, it's an enjoyable time. And yet it's also not something so amazing that I'm like, you have to see this. I'm just kind of like, yeah, it was enjoyable. It was fine. I feel kind of the same way about the book as well. I know a lot of people love the book, but yeah, I thought both were serviceable murder mysteries, but neither was mind-blowing in any way. I do like the fact that the 4 main characters are senior citizens or pensioners, as they're called in this book. And the movie does have a fantastic cast. And so not many books specifically have older people as the main characters in this way. And obviously that's a huge theme too, because I'll get into it later. But anyway, basically, sure, if you want to watch this, I wouldn't discourage it. And yeah, from here on out, I will now get into the details of the plot, which means there will be spoilers going forward. So the titular club, like I said, was created in a senior living community called Cooper's Chase, and it consists of Elizabeth. We don't know exactly what her profession had been, but it was something spy related, it seems, or, like CIA-esque. And then we have Ibrahim, who had been a psychologist, and Ron, who was a union leader who was often in the news back in the day for the various protests and things that he was part of. And then the final member is a woman named Penny, who had been on the police force. And she and Elizabeth are the two that started the club. And Penny, she had all the files from these cold cases that were never solved. And so this is where they are getting the murder mysteries that now they are trying to solve all these decades later. However, by the time the story starts in both book and movie, Penny is no longer part of the club because she has been moved to the hospice wing and is unresponsive. And so they then invite Joyce to be part of the club because she was a nurse. And so they went to her for some of the medical questions they had about a case they are currently trying to solve, where a man's girlfriend was murdered and he claims a robber did it. And then the man shortly after disappeared. And so it doesn't seem believable that a robber came in and stabbed her and left. And so this is the case they are currently investigating. And this is when Joyce becomes part of the club. However, this case that they are working on gets interrupted when a real-time murder happens. And so then they start focusing on that instead. And so the first man to be killed is named Tony, and in both book and movie, he was involved with Cooper's Chase because he was part of the company that invested in them and he was a builder. So he was partners with Ian, who is the main guy in charge of Cooper's Chase. And in the movie, Tony also has a relative living at Cooper's Chase who he dotes on. And so all the seniors love him and think that he is a great guy and they view him as being, in their corner. And in both book and movie, Ian wants to dig up the graveyard that is here at Cooper's Chase, but in the movie they have added drama because on top of digging up the graveyard, he also wants to get rid of Cooper's Chase essentially, and all of these people would be kicked out and have to find a new place to live. And so the fact that Tony is a partner with this company and he's very invested in Cooper's Chase sticking around because someone he loves is staying there, they all feel safe knowing that Tony is advocating for them despite Ian's threats. But this was not the case in the book. Tony didn't have someone staying at Cooper's Chase that he cared about. Also, Cooper's Chase wasn't at risk of being removed. They just wanted to dig up the graveyard because Cooper's Chase, it's on a property that used to be a convent. And so the graveyard is also a holy graveyard relating to the nuns that had once lived there. But Ian wants to dig this up and, put a new development on top of it. But Cooper's Chase itself, I don't think he was going to change anything with that. So the residents are simply upset in the book because they don't want this graveyard being dug up and just all the building up of the countryside, right? They're against that happening. So in both, Ian, he ends up firing Tony, despite knowing that Tony has a very shady past and isn't incapable of murder. But he fires Tony so that he can instead hire another guy he has used for smaller jobs, and this is a guy named Bogdan, who he wants to take over Tony's job for cheaper pay. And so the day he's fired, Tony is then later found dead in his apartment, and next to him is a photograph of him, Tony, Jason Ritchie, who is the son of Ron, one of the members of the Thursday Murder Club, and then also a guy named Bobby Tanner. And in the movie, Jason Ritchie is in the photo, but he had been cropped out. And so Donna is the one who sees like, oh, like there was a third person here. And she's the one who realizes that it was Jason. Whereas in the book, Jason was there in full view, but what they're like trying to figure out in the book is who took the photo. So that's the bigger mystery in the book. And so meanwhile, while they're investigating Tony's murder, Ian is dealing with, the Cooper's Chase residents protesting the removal of the cemetery. And the Thursday Murder Club and the police see Ian as a possible suspect in the Tony murder. But then at the protest at the cemetery, someone slips a lethal injection into Ian and he dies. Meanwhile, Bogdan had started digging up part of the cemetery and he finds bones that hadn't originally been part of a grave. So someone had murdered someone decades past and buried them in this existing grave. And so now it seems there is a third murder to be solved. And so while all of that is the same from book to movie, from here they start to differ. So to focus on the book plot first, and basically, long, overly complicated story short, Bogdan is the one who killed Tony because back in the day, like 20 years ago, Tony had killed someone Bogdan was very close to. And so Bogdan, I'm not totally sure how to say his name, but Bogdan, he had just been biding his time, waiting to find the perfect moment to kill Tony. And then this is when he decides it's the right time. And he very convincingly ends up pinning the murder on a guy named Gianni, who the cops had found out Gianni is the one who had taken that photo that was left by Tony's body. But Bogdan has killed Gianni, but no one knows he's dead. And so instead, people think that Gianni must have killed Tony. And in the book, the only person to find out the truth is Stephen, Elizabeth's husband. So he is starting to be kind of senile, but he is clearly aware enough that he is able to piece things together. Because he and Bogdan have formed a friendship and they play chess together. And near the end, they're playing chess and Stephen is like, you know what? Based on what I've heard Elizabeth say about the Tony murder, I think you did it. And Bogdan just very matter-of-factly is like, yeah, it was me. And he explains how he did it for revenge and how, he slowly and patiently plotted the whole thing. But then Stephen, again, he has memory issues. And so it seems like he kind of quickly forgets. And then that's it. And Bogdan gets away with it. But Bogdan, he was a likable character. And so even though you find out he's a murderer, you still kind of like him. And the people he killed were like horrible murderers themselves too, But then Ian, we find out, was killed by Penny's husband because Penny is the one who killed the man who was placed in the existing grave back in the 70s. Penny's husband, John, he killed Ian because he knew that if they dug up the cemetery, the bones would be found and investigated and Penny would be found out. And the man whose bones those are, they belonged to the boyfriend of the murdered woman the Thursday Murder Club had started to investigate at the start of the book. So again, this guy had claimed that a robber came in and stabbed his girlfriend. Penny knew that this guy was guilty. However, at this time on the police force, it was like a total boys club type of attitude. And so they just didn't, she should have gotten so many promotions, but because of the sexism of the time, she was always stuck at a certain level. And so they didn't take her as seriously as they should have. And then on top of that, Penny had just seen time and time again so many abusers get away with the abuse. And so Penny it was a breaking point and she couldn't stand to see this guy get away with murdering his girlfriend. And so she kills him and then she buries him in the graveyard. And in the book, she did not tell her husband. So for decades, he had no idea that his wife killed a man. And it isn't until she starts getting the past and the present confused that she brings it up to him and just says it again, in a very matter-of-fact way. And this is when he learns what his wife had done. And so again, eventually she becomes unresponsive and is kind of comatose. But then once he hears the graveyard is going to be dug up, obviously that is why he had been a veterinarian. So that is how he had access to these medications that could be lethal. And so yeah, he kills Ian in order to help keep Penny's reputation safe and not put her through the whole ordeal of being convicted of murder. However, the Thursday Murder Club, specifically Elizabeth, finds this out, and so she confronts them, but she tells John that, she's going to call the cops in the morning or whatever. And so basically, she's giving John time for him to peacefully kill his wife and then also himself. That way they can protect themselves in that way. And so that is what ends up happening. And throughout this book, there were so many red herrings and honestly just way too many characters in general. And I get that for a good murder mystery, you need to have a variety of suspects, right? But there were, again, just way too many people. And then some of the suspicious people, we hear their stories as to what was really happening and how they're innocent of the murder, but here's what had been going on with them. And this is why they were acting weird. And two stories in particular, Bernard and the priest, Father Mackey, both of their stories I just didn't need. I almost feel like they didn't need to be included in the book. Specifically Bernard, he was being suspicious because basically his wife had recently died. And I will say, even though I feel like his story was unnecessary and made this book longer than it needed to be, what he's going through with his wife and dealing with the loss of her, it does feed into the bigger theme going on in this book of dealing with death and grief and loss. But yeah, it turns out when she died, she had wanted her ashes to be spread in a river. And so the daughter takes the ashes to do that, but Bernard didn't want to be parted from her, not even her ashes. And so what he gave the daughter wasn't actually her ashes, and he had kept the ashes himself and buried them under a bench near the graveyard. And he is just overcome with guilt over the fact that he lied to his daughter about this. And so ultimately he ends up committing suicide because he's overcome with guilt, but also he just misses his wife so much and doesn't want to continue living without her. And so yeah, it feeds into the grief and death that is talked about in this book, which I'll get into a bit later, but I still felt like it was unnecessary. And then we have the priest, who is very passionate about not wanting the cemetery dug up, but the cops find out that he's a fraud and not a real priest, only for it later to be discovered that he actually was a real priest. However, he was kind of kicked out because he had fallen in love with a nun, because back when Cooper's Chase was a convent, he had worked there when he was young in his 20s, and he had fallen in love with a nun who was also young, and she ended up getting pregnant. And then when the head superior nun found out, she was told that she was going to have to be kicked out of the convent. And so the nun, rather than deal with that shame and ridicule, she killed herself instead. However, Father Mackey, they knew he was the man who impregnated her. And so they tell him that he has to leave, but they do still honor the nun and allow her to be buried in the cemetery where nuns are buried. And so she still had that honor. And so Father Mackey, he returns all these years later to be a priest again, and he is fighting to keep the graveyard there because it's his way to try to honor this woman he had loved, because he doesn't want her body dug up and removed from this sacred place that meant so much to her. And again, I felt like this was an unnecessary side plot in the book that could have been cut. Also, in the book, there were times when I felt like we were led to believe that Joyce might be involved in one of these murders somehow, and yet that doesn't come to anything. But that was a red herring I actually did like. I'm still kind of suspicious of Joyce. Did she really not have anything suspicious in her past? I feel like maybe in next books we do find something out, but in this book, she was not involved in any of the murders that take place. And then the Gianni guy, who again had been affiliated with Tony, and then Bogdan pins it all on Gianni, who is dead. Everything with him was just kind of overly complicated. And I feel like, this was this author's first book, and I feel like he did the mistake of trying to include too much. He had too many characters, he had too many storylines, some of which did not even matter and could have been cut. But then also this whole Gianni storyline was also like sort of convoluted and messy, and I felt like he didn't execute all of these threads he had going on. He didn't execute it the best. I'm sure as time went on, he has become an even better writer, and I have heard that the second book is better than the first, so I am curious to read that. But yeah, I feel like with certain things, he just didn't execute it very well, and he would have been better served had he kept the storyline simpler. And I didn't even mention Bobby Tanner, but yet again, he wasn't connected to the murders, and I don't even feel the need to get into him as a character because he just didn't end up being all that important. Same with Jason Ritchie, who again arouses suspicion, and yet he wasn't to blame for anything, and it's not even worth talking about him, honestly. But to move on to the movie now, they do make some significant changes, which, as I've been saying, there were things I didn't love about the book, so I'm fine with the movie making changes to it. For example, they cut out Bernard. We have Father Mackey. Well, we actually see Bernard, but it's like one brief scene. And we have Father Mackey, but we don't get into his backstory at all either. And so, yeah, I like that they cut these characters and didn't delve into their past because it just wasn't necessary. Sorry, my hair, I don't usually straighten it like this where my bangs, and it keeps getting in the way. Sorry if that's annoying. Anyway, here, once more, just to cut to the chase, Bogdan is who killed Tony. However, it was not on purpose, unlike the book. So here, Tony and Bobby Tanner, they have this trafficking scheme going on where they bring in foreigners who need work and then they take their passports in order to control them, basically. And Bogdan hadn't been home to visit his mother, who he misses dearly, and she's also not doing well. And so he wants to be able to go visit her, and so he goes to Tony to try to get his passport because, by the way, in both book and movie, Bogdan is from Poland. And so in the movie, he goes to Tony to get his passport to see his mom, and however, things go awry, and he ends up killing Tony, even though that's not what he intended. And in the end, Stephen, kind of like the book, he and Bogdan have become friends and they play chess. And once again, he tells Bogdan that he thinks he is the killer. And here, like the book, Bogdan confesses that yes, he did kill him. However, it's not in the book, he was so matter of fact about it and just yeah, it was me. Whereas here he's yeah, it was me, but I didn't mean to. It was an accident. And then soon after he says this, Stephen, has an episode and then he forgets what had just been said and he forgets what they had been talking about. Meanwhile, Elizabeth has been talking to Bobby Tanner, who, by the way, he had been threatening Elizabeth throughout the movie with notes and people giving her, these messages stop digging or, stop what you're doing. Don't look any further. Leave this alone. But she ends up finding Bobby Tanner. And again, he is involved in this passport scheme. And also in the movie, Bobby Tanner is one of the investors in Cooper's Chase, along with Ian and Tony. And now that Ian and Tony are dead, it all belongs to Bobby Tanner, who has now become a florist, by the way, which was also the case in the book. But Elizabeth is with him when she hears them talking about the passports, and then she realizes, wait a minute, because she had become friends with Bogdan, and she knew how he didn't have his passport, and that's why he couldn't visit his mom. So she realizes in this moment that he was the killer, and she knows that he is with Stephen playing chess, and so she freaks out, and she calls, she's already with Donna the cop, but she calls the others, being go to my flat right away. And she's worried that Bogdan has poisoned Stephen, and the audience is kind of led to believe he may have done something. But turns out he didn't try to kill Stephen. But she reveals in front of everybody that Stephen records the chess games, which means despite Bogdan denying he is the murderer, she reveals that his confession is on tape from when he said it to Stephen, and Bogdan is then arrested. And I have not yet read the second book, but I do know that Bogdan is in the second book. I don't know how big of a part he plays, but considering he's around, I'm wondering, if they adapt the sequel, which I hope they do. Clearly obviously they have no issues making changes to the plot because they made changes here. But for the sequel, if Bogdan is supposed to be part of the sequel, are they just going to write him out of it since now he's in prison? Unless it's determined it was self-defense and then maybe he'll be let out. I'm not sure. But yeah, I think book readers will be disappointed to the change with Bogdan because his character is just very different. It seemed like he was older in the book. So here he's very young in the film. But yeah, I think this is what will upset readers the most is the significant changes they did to Bogdan. But then as far as the bones Bogdan had found, which he told Elizabeth about, in the book, the Thursday Murder Club, they researched into the bones themselves and figure out how old they are before then telling the police. And Chris and Donna, specifically Chris, get really upset at them for taking these matters into their own hands, and it's this whole thing. Whereas in the movie, she tells the police right away, and then like right away, they are able to tell her who the bones belong to. So it's not a mystery like it was in the book where it's like, ooh, who was the body? Like here, we're told very quickly. But then as in the book, once again, we find out that Penny killed this man. However, unlike the book and the movie, Penny had told her husband right away, and so he helped her bury the body. And so again, now that he knows the graveyard is being dug up, that is why he then killed Ian to stop the bones from being found and investigated. But yeah, in the book, it's kind of crazy that Penny had kept this secret from her husband for decades, that she murdered a man. But yeah, the movie makes the change where he helped her bury the body and has known about it all along. But then also like the book, Elizabeth as well as the other members of the club confront John about this. And then as in the book, he ends up killing himself and Penny. So it ends with their funeral. But then to talk about Donna and Chris, who I've sort of briefly mentioned. So the Thursday Murder Club befriended Donna, who was a new officer from the city. And between the police and the Thursday Murder Club, they work together to find evidence. And Chris is the supervisor of the investigation. But in the movie, he seems kind of dumb. Like he didn't know who Bobby Tanner was, despite a lot of other people, including Donna, knew who he was. And he's a very infamous criminal. And yet this guy in charge of murder investigations has no idea who he is. And then with the photograph, like I said in the movie, Jason Ritchie was cut from the photo. Like it's very clear that someone had been there, and then she sees his arm in a reflection. And so it's like, how did Chris, the guy who's in charge, totally miss that? Like, he kind of sucks at his job. But maybe, again, Donna came from the city, so maybe even though she's a lower rank, she has more experience than Chris, who works in this small town who probably doesn't have a lot of murder cases. So maybe that's why he just wasn't as clever as Donna was, because he hasn't needed to be. By the way, to mention Jason in the movie, they find him suspicious as well and even arrest him. But we find out his alibi is that he was having an affair with Ian's wife, because in the movie, Ian and his wife are getting a divorce. And yeah, we find out that Jason had been sleeping with her. But then also in the movie, Donna and Chris are like 10 or so years apart, maybe a little more. Whereas in the book, it was a bigger age gap between the two of them. And in the end, Donna sets up Chris with her mom. And also the mom reveals that Donna's full name is Madonna, which, was kind of a funny moment. Also in the book, we learn more just about Donna's background and why she left the city, but it was kind of cliche, and it was just like, oh, a boyfriend that dumped her. She dumped him. I don't even remember, but she leaves the city because of that. And now she's really bored working this country job that's not as interesting. And also we get a cliche scene in the book where Elizabeth is like, let me guess, Donna, and she explains Donna's whole life story, and, she hits the nail on the head because, she's just so witty and she knows all these details without having to be told. And that's kind of a silly cliche that I recently have started to be annoyed by. And so I was glad that the movie didn't have that moment. But then as far as the fate of Cooper's Chase, so in the book, Joyce has mentioned that there's this weird company that has been buying up properties. And in the end, we find out that this company is owned by her daughter, Joanna. So Joanna at the start had not liked that her mom had moved into this community and felt like it would be bad for her. She was just worried about her mom's well-being since the death of her husband, Joanna's father. However, partway through the story, she sees that her mom is thriving here and she's making friends and she's doing so good. And so, because this place is so important to Joyce, Joanna has started buying up the property and taking over the company. And so Joanna ends up being in charge by the end of the book. Whereas in the movie, so Bobby Tanner was left in charge, but he and Elizabeth make a deal that involves him agreeing to only sell to someone that Elizabeth deems fit, basically. He can't sell it without Elizabeth telling him who to sell it to. And in the end, Joanna walks up to her mom, who is with Elizabeth, and she has the same sentiment as the book, where she's like, oh, this place is so good for you. I never thought I would see you happy again, but you are, and this place is amazing. And then Elizabeth is like, well, why don't you buy it? So in the movie, Elizabeth is the reason why Joanna buys Cooper's Chase. And then final book versus movie thoughts. So even though I have my complaints with the book and it's not like a perfect murder mystery by any means, I did kind of like the way Bogdan reveals that he was the murderer. Again, it was kind of a funny moment. And I did like the friendship he had with Stephen and with Elizabeth. And so I did like all of that. And so, yeah, I was surprised that the movie made such a significant change as far as his character was concerned. And then Joyce also is a little different from book to movie just because in the book, she was a very big character because the book has third-person narrator, but mixed in with that, we get Joyce's diary entries, which gives the reader a deeper connection to her than we had to the other characters in many ways. And so that was missing from the movie as well because I felt just as connected to Joyce as I did the others. Or at least just as connected to her as I did to Elizabeth, I guess I should say. Speaking of which, Elizabeth is played by Helen Mirren, and there's a part when her husband tells her she looks like the Queen, which is funny because Helen Mirren played the Queen in the movie. I think it was called The Queen. So that was a funny little moment. But then while the movie does touch on the fact, speaking of Stephen and Elizabeth, the movie does touch on the fact that our main characters have death lingering over them in a sense because, we see Penny has been moved to hospice and Stephen, he is going to need to be moved there too at some point in the book specifically. Elizabeth is stressing about this. And while we do touch on this in the film, in the book, it was a much bigger thing. And I thought the author wrote about it in a really beautiful way. And then the book and movie both kind of have that message of, often older people, senior citizens are overlooked and we deem them as, not useful anymore, kind of like we almost start to see them as children again to some extent and undermine them and undervalue them. And so the book and movie both have the theme of being like, hey, just because they're in their 70s or whatever, they're still human beings who are still very capable and very smart and very passionate. And so I did think the book had that message in a way that didn't come across as condescending and it was well executed in that sense. And then I did like that in the movie as well. And I also liked, in both book and movie, we see how the Thursday Murder Club, they will take advantage of the way younger people view them as a way to get what they want. Like they're manipulating the system that usually overlooks them. And so it's funny because my favorite things about this book in many ways aren't even about the murder mystery, because the murder mystery aspect, I'll be honest, as I was reading, I almost didn't care who the killer was. One of the more recent murder mysteries I've read was The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And the mystery aspect was so gripping. And I was just like, I was so invested. And then when the reveal happens in that book, it's just so well done. And you're just like, wow, that was incredible. Whereas here, I wasn't too invested in who the killer was. And while I like how the reveal is done during the chess game, the fact that it was Bogdan and it connected to a previous murder we heard about with Tony, it was all fine. It wasn't something that's wow, so unique and different for the genre. It was all just kind of oh, cool, okay. And then I also suspected that the case with the murdered girlfriend at the start, as I was reading the book, I suspected that would come into play. And I did like how that was wrapped up in the book too. And I like that the movie stayed faithful to it. But yeah, when it comes to book versus movie, even if I was a little underwhelmed by the book, especially as far as the mystery aspect goes, and then again, way too many characters. So while it's not a perfect book, I will still say that when it comes to book versus movie, the book still wins over the movie. And again, I just really liked how the book delves into the themes of loss and grief and death, and the fact that the Thursday Murder Club members, they deal with this as a regular part of their life, being in the later stages of their life, and so seeing all of them struggle with this in one way or another, I thought was really well done in the book. But I did enjoy the movie, it was fine. And again, I do really like the cast, and I do hope they adapt the sequel. So I am curious to read that. Whether they adapt it or not, I do want to read the sequel because again, I've heard it's better than the first book. But I hope this movie does well enough that they go ahead and make the sequel, and I would definitely be watching it. And that wraps it up for the Thursday Murder Club. I hope you all enjoyed watching this video. Time for me to drink my invisible tea. And don't forget to like and subscribe and comment your thoughts down below. Again, I know this book has a lot of fans, so let me know what you think down below in the comments. And I will see you next time. Bye.